Welcome to this program in the Our Finger Lakes History Series. I am Seneca County historian Walter Gable. The topic of this program is the Sullivan Expedition of 1779, which is also known as the Sullivan-Clinton Campaign of 1779. It was a major military offensive ordered by General George Washington in the American Revolutionary War, and its focus was our Finger Lakes. In this map, you see that the line drawn in the Treaty of Fort Stanwix of 1768. In that treaty, the British pledged that the Iroquois were guaranteed the lands west and north of that line. So the Finger Lakes region was clearly in the land promised to remain controlled by the Iroquois. The problem was colonial settlers were moving more and more into the areas that bordered on that treaty line and even began to threaten to move across the boundary line into the lands of Iroquois. So when the American Revolutionary War broke out, the Iroquois tribes had to decide if they were going to remain neutral or side with the British or side with the American colonists. Although they were first neutral, most of the Iroquois tribes sided with the British. This is probably because the Iroquois had more hope that the British would live up to their promise made in the Treaty of Fort Stanwix of 1768, while the Iroquois realized they had no hope that the victorious colonists would forever abide by that treaty. The Iroquois helped the British in the American Revolutionary War. One way the Iroquois helped was to actually help with the military actions of the British. Iroquois men fought along with the British armies. Another way, the Iroquois also conducted terrorist raids on colonials settled in the frontier areas. Here you see two maps showing the location of Iroquois raids on colonials settled in frontier areas. At the top is one associated with the Wyoming Massacre in northern Pennsylvania on July 3, 1778. On that day, Colonel Butler led the Loyalist forces, which included a force of Senecas and Cayugas. More than 300 colonial patriots were killed in the battle. After the battle, Iroquois raiders apparently hunted down and killed fleeing patriots. It is reported that the Iroquois committed ritual torture against 30 to 40 patriots who had surrendered until they died. The second map at the bottom shows the location of Cherry Valley in New York. Following the surrender of British forces at the Battle of Saratoga in October 1777, the British troops and the Iroquois turned much of their focus to the Mohawk River and the Cherry Valley areas of New York. This area was fertile land for providing food supplies. On November 11, 1778, British and Iroquois forces attacked a fort in Cherry Valley. There were 442 Indians, 200 Tories under the command of Colonel Butler, and Captain Joseph Brant for the Iroquois. When the British and Indian forces couldn't take the fort, they turned to rampage the settlement outside of the fort. As you can see in the painting on the left, 30 civilians were killed. Another 70, mostly women and children, were taken as captives. This attack had been described as one of the most horrific frontier massacres of the Revolutionary War. This Cherry Valley Massacre, along with what happened in Wyoming, PA, as well as other terrorist raids on the frontier, brought strong calls for the Continental Army to take action. George Washington realized this was necessary. These Iroquois Indian raids on Patriot colonial settlements in the frontier of New York and Pennsylvania were extremely upsetting to the Continental Congress and George Washington. Although there were some retaliatory raids on some Iroquois villages, George Washington wanted to do much more. He envisioned a major military offensive into the heartland of the Six Nations of Iroquois. This heartland is the Finger Lakes region. On May 31, 1779, George Washington issued an order to General John Sullivan. As you can see in this portion of Washington's orders, Sullivan's forces were to destroy the Iroquois settlements, a virtual scorched earth policy, so that the Iroquois would not be able to continue to provide food supplies or soldiers for the British. I think you can also envision that because of the terrorist Indian raids on the Patriot Colonials, including non-combatants as well as Patriot soldiers, revenge considerations probably added to Washington's orders. This military expedition that Washington ordered would be the first real military offensive on the part of Washington in the Revolutionary War. There were actually 4 components to General Washington's ordered military action, and this map shows the 4 parts. Shown at left, one component was that of Colonel Brodhead, marching from Fort Pitt, present Pittsburgh, up into the southwestern part of present New York State. At upper right, another component was Colonel Goose Van Schaik, leading forces against the Onondagas into what is present Syracuse. At lower right, a third component was Brigadier General James Clinton, proceeding from Fort Schuyler and Stanwix to destroy the Mohawk Indians and then join up with General Sullivan near the New York-Pennsylvania border. Shown in the center, this program will deal only with that 4th component, which is the expedition of Major General John Sullivan into the Finger Lakes. Shown here are the 2 generals who were involved in this military offensive called for by General Washington. As you can see in this map, shown in the light green line, General Clinton was to march his 1,500 troops from the Mohawk River Valley southwest to Tioga, PA. Shown as a red line, General Sullivan would march his 2,000 troops northwest to Tioga, PA, where they would meet up with the troops of General Clinton. On August 26, the joint forces of about 3,000 men, 250 pack horses, 9 pieces of artillery that included 4 6-pounders and 4 3-pounder cannons, this Sullivan expedition left Tioga, PA, and started their march towards the Finger Lakes region of the Senecas and the Cayugas. In case you are wondering why this military campaign is commonly referred to as the Sullivan Expedition, when General Clinton was also involved, let me say that Sullivan's forces were the advance group as they moved northward, with Clinton's forces at the rear. However, historians have more recently tried to call it the Sullivan-Clinton campaign. The British and Indian forces were well aware of the Sullivan-Clinton forces. Colonel John Butler commanded the British forces of about 300 men, and they became known as Butler's Rangers. The Iroquois allies were led by Joseph Brant, a Mohawk chief. There were about 400 Iroquois fighters. Unfortunately for this side in the war, the top British commanders did not provide troops or additional supplies to Butler's and Brant's forces. So Butler and Brant knew they were going to be outnumbered in any actual fighting with the advancing Sullivan Expedition forces. British Commander Butler and Mohawk Chief Joseph Brant, therefore, chose an ambush site near the village of Newtown, near present Elmira, New York. They did this largely because their combined forces of at most 1,200 were going to have to confront perhaps as many as 4,000 in the Sullivan Expedition forces. The British Iroquois forces chose a highland area. Normally this might be good, but they didn't have defense against the artillery that the Sullivan Expedition forces had. This map gives some idea of how easy it was for the superior Sullivan Expedition numbers to overwhelm the British Iroquois forces on August 29th. The Sullivan forces were greater in number and had divided into two lines of attack. They used their artillery very effectively, and the artillery bombardments rattled the Iroquois, who many fled. In a short period of time, the Tories and the Iroquois broke their lines, and the Sullivan forces were victorious. The entire battle lasted about 7 hours. Sullivan reported that only 3 of his men were killed and only 36 wounded. We don't have reliable statistics on the casualties on the other side. However, after the battle, 11 Indian warriors and 1 woman were found dead. At least one source says that the Sullivan troops scalped the 11 Indian warriors. So don't think that such violence was only done by the Iroquois. Detachments of Sullivan troops also burned about 150 acres of corn. So by the time of the Battle of Newtown, the Clinton and Sullivan forces had already destroyed about 14 villages. Following their victory at Newtown, the Sullivan-Clinton forces probably should have pursued the retreating Tory and Indian forces to Fort Niagara, but this didn't happen. Instead, Sullivan decided to proceed northward to the Finger Lakes. As the Sullivan-Clinton forces continued to advance northward into the Finger Lakes, the Indians largely fled. As you see in this map, you see the march route of the Sullivan-Clinton forces as they proceeded from Newtown. They met little resistance the rest of their march through the Finger Lakes. They marched to St. Catherine's, present Montour Falls, and then to the south end of Seneca Lake on September 2nd, 1779. We know a lot about the day-to-day activities of this Sullivan Expedition forces because of the notes and journal entries of several officers and soldiers. For example, Lieutenant Ercures Beatty wrote on September 3rd, quote, Seneca Lake, which is a very pretty lake, most part of the land today was excellent. About 1 mile in front of our camp was a house that Indians had just left and left their kettles on the fire, boiling fine corn and beans, which we got, unquote. The Sullivan-Clinton forces then marched inland a short distance from the east shore of Seneca Lake as they proceeded north. They did this by largely following an Indian trail, so as to avoid having to cross the deep ravines of the many streams emptying into Seneca Lake. Because I am the Seneca County historian, I have to highlight that these troops marched through present-day Seneca County on September 3, 4, 5, and 6 until they reached Candia, Saga, near present Geneva, on September 7th. Lieutenant Colonel Adam Hubley in his journal wrote, quote, "We passed through a delightful level country. The soil of which was very rich, the timber fine and large, interspersed with hazel bushes, fine grass, and pea vines," unquote. Major Jeremiah Fogg said in his September 7th journal entry, quote, "The land between the Seneca and Cayuga Lakes appears good, level, and well-timbered, affording a sufficiency for 20 elegant townships, which in process of time will doubtless add to the importance of America," unquote. At various places in the expedition, there were reports of finding ears of corn 22 inches long. It is easy to conclude that any man hearing soldiers' accounts of that nature would realize this was a frontier area filled with farm opportunities. This is what will happen after the Revolutionary War. Let me give you an idea of the total destruction that the Sullivan forces did at each Iroquois village they encountered by telling you about the destruction of the Seneca village at Candia on September 5th. At Candia, they found the Indian villagers had fled, typical. So the soldiers proceeded to burn the Indian houses, set the cornfields on fire, and burn other things. They girdled or cut down the fruit trees. Their actions were indeed a scorched earth campaign. They also found and took 60 to 70 livestock. At Candia, they found a white captive named Luke Swetland. Swetland informed the Sullivan forces that he understood there would be nearly 1,000 Indian warriors at Candia, Saga at the head of Seneca Lake. But that warning did not stop the Sullivan forces from continuing their total destruction of Candia and continuing on. There are many New York State historic markers throughout the routes of the Sullivan Expedition in the Finger Lakes. This one is shown is for Candia. Note, however, that it has an incorrect date. It says September 17th instead of September 5th. Let me add that the Sullivan and Clinton forces destroyed these various Iroquois villages. So the Iroquois referred to General George Washington as Contocarius, or town destroyer. Just like there are several of the New York State historic markers throughout the Finger Lakes, there are several of these stone monuments with metal plaques. This is the one at Candia. I have enlarged the center portion of the plaque so that you can get an idea of just how beautifully detailed these markers are. The largest Iroquois settlement so far in the campaign was the one they came to on September 7th. It is called Candia, Saga, with many different spellings of that name. It is located about where the Cornell Agritech, former Geneva Experiment Station, is today. I have shown the stone monument for this Indian village, and on the right I have typed in the text of the plaque wording. I have highlighted some of the wording in red ink so that you can see that 50 to 80 Indian houses were destroyed, and that there had previously been an older village called Canachstage about 2 miles south in the White Springs Road and Lane area. The only human being found at Canada Saga was a white boy, 3 or 4 years old, emaciated almost to a skeleton. He was sitting on the grass playing with a chicken. He could only say in English that his mammy was gone. He was fed and clothed, which seemed to please the little fellow much. Captain Machen of the artillery unit carried him home to Kingston after the Sullivan Expedition, but he died 2 years later of smallpox. His parentage was never discovered. What a sad, lonely little kid and story. On September 9th, the Sullivan forces left the Geneva area and marched west towards present Canandaigua. September 10th, they reached the Indian village there and found the campfires of the fugitive Indians still burning. They destroyed 23 fine houses. September 11th, they marched to the north end of Honeoye Lake and destroyed 20 Indian houses there. They kept one storehouse made by the Indians so that they could store supplies that Sullivan decided not to take with him as he proceeded west towards Geneseo. He also left 300 sick and lame under the command of Captain Cummings with 50 men in support there. On September 12th, the Sullivan main unit crossed Hemlock Lake and Canisius Lake, and they sent an advance party led by Thomas Boyd to gather information on the suspected British forces that were gathering somewhere around Geneseo. Shown at right is a portrait of Lieutenant Thomas Boyd. He was Sullivan's most trusted scout. He had played a major role in the Sullivan-Clinton forces for their successful attack at Newton. So it was not surprising that Sullivan decided to send Boyd on this scouting mission in the Geneseo area to locate the Indian village that was believed to be the biggest of all of the Iroquois villages in the Finger Lakes, and to find where the British forces were. The Seneca Indian village is known by various names. It is commonly referred to as Geneseo or Geneseo. If you look at the map, you can see that on the night of September 12th, the Sullivan forces are camped between Lakes Canisius and Hemlock. More specifically, the forces are camped on the high ground on the east side of Canisius Lake. What Boyd's mission didn't know was that a large group of Indian warriors under Chief Joseph Brand and British forces under the command of Colonel John Butler, a force of approximately 1,000, was not far away at all, and they were planning to ambush the advancing Sullivan forces of nearly 3,000. The ambush was probably a necessary strategy because of the numerical advantage that the Sullivan forces had. Butler knew the Sullivan forces were basically following Indian trails. Butler knew that Sullivan's forces were no longer moving with their heavy cannon, so Butler set up an ambush site of a ravine on the slopes west of Canisius Lake. His side forces would be on top of the ravine and would have the superior position and the element of surprise. Boyd's group of about 25 men left the camp on the night of September 12th, passed by John Butler's ambush site without either side noticing the other. Before dawn the next morning, Boyd's scouting party arrived at the Indian village of Gassawarhore, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right at all, and found that village abandoned. They encountered later that morning several Indians, killing one. Boyd sent 2 runners back to Sullivan to tell him that the scouting party was returning. Boyd sent 2 more runners to report that the scouting party would wait on the trail for the Sullivan army to reach them. The Indian scout, a Mohawk chief named Hanyost, warned that the Seneca Indians were setting up a trap for the scouting party. Despite the warning, Boyd's scouting party proceeded down the Indian trail to return to the main Sullivan forces. Boyd's scouting party ran into the trap that Hanyost had warned against. The scouting group casualties were twice what the Sullivan forces had incurred total at the Newtown battle. Boyd and Michael Parker were captured. 8 of the scouting party managed to escape and reported back to Sullivan. Now that there was no chance of an ambush attack on the Sullivan forces, Colonel Butler's forces retreated. However, Lieutenant Thomas Boyd and Sergeant Michael Parker were barbarously tortured, as you can see in the quoted portion of the journal entry of one of the soldiers. Massacred in the most cruel and barbarous manner that the human mind can possibly conceive, the savages having put them to the most excruciating torments possible, by first plucking their nails from their hands, then spearing, cutting, and whipping them, mangling their bodies, then cutting off flesh from their shoulders by pieces, tomahawking and severing their heads from their bodies, and leaving them a prey to the dogs. Shown here is an even more graphic description of the brutal torture of Boyd and Parker. You will note that their genitals were mutilated, their noses and tongues were cut off, and their eyes gouged out. Their abdomens were cut open, and one end of their intestines attached to the torture tree shown here, and then they had to march around the tree, tightening their intestines tighter and tighter. The bodies of Boyd and Parker were found by the Sullivan forces when they entered the deserted Seneca village of Geneseo on September 14th. Boyd and Parker were given a burial with full military honors. The abandoned Seneca village of Geneseo, or Genesee Castle, consisting of 128 houses, was burned to the ground. It took 2 days to get the crops into the huts before the huts were burned. Stores that could not be burned were hurriedly dumped into the river. With the loss of his most trusted scout, coupled with some concern about dwindling supplies, General Sullivan decided not to proceed further west to Fort Niagara. Instead, he decided that his mission to destroy the ability of the Iroquois Indians in the Finger Lakes to aid the British had been accomplished, and he started the retreat back to Fort Sullivan at Tioga, Pennsylvania. Leaving the Geneseo area, the Sullivan forces marched back to Honeoye, which they reached September 17th. They gathered up the 50 soldiers left there and the sick, and then they proceeded towards Canada Saga. On September 20th and 21st, back at Canada Saga, General Sullivan had some of his troops split up into 4 detachments. A detachment under Colonel Smith proceeded south from Canada Saga to Kashong to burn cornfields and then continue on the west side of Seneca Lake, destroying any crops and villages. His route is shown as the yellow line. Colonel William Butler's line is shown in the broken black line on the east side of Seneca Lake. Colonel William Butler and 500 troops marched east and then down the east side of Cayuga Lake in the broken black line mark, destroying any Indian villages and crops en route. Colonel Peter Gansefort's detachment, which is shown in the solid blue line at the top, they marched to the north side of the Seneca River and then went on to Albany to retrieve supplies there and then take those supplies to Tioga, PA, where his forces would rendezvous with the main Sullivan forces. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Dearborn's detachment, which is shown as the dotted red line on the map, would destroy Indian villages and crops that they encountered on the west side of Cayuga Lake, and then meet with Colonel Butler's detachment near present Ithaca and proceed to Tioga, PA. General Sullivan on September 24th left Canada Saga with the main forces that basically retraced his route on the east side of Seneca Lake to St. Catharines. Now to show this a little more specifically. This map shows the route of Colonel Butler's detachment down the east side of Cayuga Lake. Several Indian villages of the Cayugas and their crops were destroyed. Two key ones were Cayuga Castle in the Great Gully area and Chanandote, or Peachtree Town, at present-day Aurora. The Butler detachment continued down to present-day Ithaca and then joined with Colonel Dearborn's detachment on September 27th. I've shown here two of the historic markers. There are several such along the route of Colonel Butler's detachment. Together, Butler's and Dearborn's detachments will arrive at Fort Sullivan in Tioga, PA. Next, we see the Lieutenant Colonel Henry Dearborn, who led a detachment of about 700 soldiers, basically down the west side of Cayuga Lake. I have shown some of the historic markers that denote the Indian villages and places of encampment of this Dearborn detachment. Dearborn was moving down the west side of Cayuga Lake, while Colonel Butler was moving down the east side of Cayuga Lake. Colonel William Smith was ordered to take a small detachment and go south on the west side of Seneca Lake to then rendezvous with the main Sullivan forces at St. Catharines. The detachment marched to Kashong, which had been previously destroyed, but their orders were to destroy whatever cornfields were still standing in the Kashong area. As they proceeded south, they destroyed some small Indian villages and some crops. While this Smith detachment was marching down on the west side of Seneca Lake, the main Sullivan forces were marching down the east side of the lake. The Smith detachment met up with the main Sullivan forces at St. Catharines, and together they proceeded to Fort Sullivan at Tioga, PA. Let me share one tidbit of trivia information about Colonel William Smith. He married Abigail Adams, daughter of President John and Abigail Adams. Colonel Peter Gansefort led a detachment of about 100 soldiers along the north side of the Seneca River from Canada Saga and then on to present Syracuse and then on his way to Albany. The map, shown in a dashed red, shows the basic routing all the way to Albany, where the detachment would retrieve supplies and then take those supplies to Tioga, PA, where they would meet the Sullivan forces. You will note in lower right a picture of the damaged historic marker that had stood for many years on routes 5 and 20 just west of the hamlet of Seneca Falls, denoting this route. This route has special meaning for me in that this detachment probably marched right along my current residence in the hamlet of Seneca Falls. Shortly after these three detachments left Canada Saga, General Sullivan left there with the rest of the soldiers. Headed for St. Catharines and ultimately Fort Sullivan, these Sullivan forces were basically retracing the route that they had followed on the east side of Seneca Lake as they advanced north from Newtown. I want you to see in these maps the location of Horseheads, New York, and Fort Reed, which is present-day Elmira, New York. You will note in these maps that after leaving Canada, Saga, or present Geneva, the Sullivan forces had been retracing the route down the east side of Seneca Lake. The route from Catherinestown, present Montour Falls, had been through a swampy area, but because of the dryness of the late summer, the swampy area was really not that swampy at all. Nevertheless, by the time the Sullivan forces reached present-day Horseheads, just north of present Elmira, on September 24, 1779, the journey of the past several weeks had been particularly severe and wearing upon the pack animals, and the food supply for these pack animals was insufficient. So in what had been a 450-mile journey for many of these pack horses up to that point, it is easy to realize that many of these pack horses were simply at the end of their endurance. General Sullivan decided, for humanitarian reasons, to dispose of a number of sick and disabled pack horses. Within the next few years, some returning Iroquois arranged the now sun-bleached skulls of those horses in a line along the trail. From that time forward, that spot was referred to as the Valley of the Horses' Heads. This kind of arrangement was a defiant gesture, indicating that the same fate would be met by any white settlers should they attempt to settle in the area. So the community that developed on this spot became known as Horseheads, and here you see the horse monument in front of an office complex. Horseheads is the first and only town and village in the entire United States dedicated to the service of the American military horse. By September 28th, the detachment of Butler, Dearborn, and Smith had rendezvoused with the main Sullivan forces, and they reached Fort Sullivan at Tioga, PA. On September 30th, the Sullivan forces reached Fort Wyoming, and General Sullivan declared his ordered mission had been completed. The Waterloo Library and Historical Society planned and conducted a major centennial celebration of the Sullivan Expedition in September 1879. In Lafayette Park, the Society erected the Scoilles Monument shown at left, which still stands today. On the north side of the monument is an inscription that says the monument commemorates the destruction of the Indian village known as Scoilles by soldiers under Colonel John Harper, September 8, 1779. On the south side of the monument, there is an inscription that says Scoilles, and the phrase that translates as, quote, once a home, now a memory. At right is a drawing of the log cabin that was erected on the county fairgrounds in Waterloo. If you look carefully at this drawing, you will see the year 1779 on the right wall of the cabin. It was at the fairgrounds that the most elaborate of the festivities were held. In addition to this day-long commemoration, the Waterloo Library and Historical Society published a book containing the speeches of the day as well as journal entries from several of the soldiers and officers in the Sullivan Expedition 100 years earlier. Even bigger commemorations took place throughout the Finger Lakes to mark the sesquicentennial of the Sullivan Expedition in 1929. Shown here is a picture of the tens of thousands arriving for the Elmira event, which was the last of 3 gigantic pageant events held in the Finger Lakes. Let me add the little celebration, however, was done to mark the bicentennial of the Sullivan Expedition in 1979. Throughout the Finger Lakes, there are several stone monuments and historic markers for events of the Sullivan Expedition. Many of these were erected shortly after the 1929 sesquicentennial of the Sullivan Expedition. Also in 1929, there was published a history of the Finger Lakes region, and the book was entitled 150 Years of Progress. Again, part of the sesquicentennial, 150 years after the Sullivan Expedition. As for some facts about the Sullivan Expedition, the total devastation was enormous. Numbers vary from account to account, but at least 40 Iroquois villages were burned to the ground, and at least 160,000 bushels of Iroquois corn were destroyed. The Iroquois in the Finger Lakes would not be able to provide any food supplies to the British in the next year because of the destruction of these crops. The Seneca and Cayuga had largely fled the Finger Lakes region and now became a food burden on the British at Fort Niagara. There are some reasons that help to explain why the Sullivan Expedition was as successful as it might be considered. One of these factors is that the weather cooperated. Another factor was that Sullivan benefited from having experienced officers and well-trained and disciplined soldiers. Another factor is the lack of adequate supplies that hindered the British and Iroquois forces that were to oppose the advancing Sullivan forces. But Sullivan also suffered from limited supplies, and that helps to explain why he did not proceed to Fort Niagara from Geneseo. This was an unusual campaign in that Sullivan was ordered to what has become known as a scorched earth policy. In other words, a total destruction of the villages and crops. So a war against an entire people was taking place, and not just against an enemy army. This helps to explain why George Washington and subsequent presidents of the United States came to be known by the phrase, "He who destroys villages." I add that the Indian village at present Canandaigua that Sullivan forces first learned of grapes, an agricultural product that has become very important in our Finger Lakes. Now to place some judgment on the Sullivan Expedition of 1779. From one viewpoint, General Sullivan carried out his mission as ordered by General George Washington to destroy the ability of the Iroquois in the Finger Lakes region to continue to help the British in the Revolutionary War. But the Sullivan Expedition did not destroy the spirit of the Iroquois. The expedition increased the dislike of the Iroquois people towards the Patriots. As that quote in green suggests, the nests may have been destroyed, but the birds can come back and build new nests. As an example to illustrate this quote, in 1780, a second raid in the Cherry Valley destroyed an estimated 1,000 homes, 1,000 barns, and 600,000 bushels of grain of Patriot settlers. One historian has pointed out that the Sullivan Expedition left the people of New York more vulnerable than before Sullivan's expedition. Perhaps fortunately, the surrender of the British in the American Revolution in October 1781 meant that the British would now no longer be any supply help to their Indian allies. Several of the surviving Iroquois eventually settled in a community called Buffalo Creek, but many Iroquois returned to the Finger Lakes. This presence of the Iroquois in the Finger Lakes, coupled with their intensified dislike of the Patriots, is going to be a problem for the Americans who want to come into the Finger Lakes region to settle after the American Revolutionary War. In another interpretation, an argument can be made that the Sullivan Expedition might be considered an act of genocide of the Iroquois. The Sullivan Expedition did result in a few Iroquois killed, and over 5,000 fled to Fort Niagara to get protection from the British forces there. It is also a fact that by 1780, the Haudenosaunee population had been cut in half. I have included here two quotes from contemporary Haudenosaunee that help to express this idea that the Sullivan Expedition might be considered an act of genocide. Members of the Sullivan Expedition shared their journal accounts with coastal residents. These accounts told of the natural beauty of the Finger Lakes region and described the agriculture of the Iroquois. These accounts motivated many Americans to want to move into the Finger Lakes and make their own farm and prosper. This is what largely happened throughout the Finger Lakes in the years after the American Revolutionary War. The Sullivan Expedition had helped to bring that about. I hope you have enjoyed this important piece of our Finger Lakes history.